The town of Iron Ridge, West Virginia, greeted Claire Donovan not with a welcome, but with a suffocating silence. Nestled in a valley where the Appalachian Mountains once seemed to promise protection, the town now felt like a cage. A fine layer of coal dust and neglect coated everything, from the faded lettering on the for sale signs in storefront windows to the peeling paint on the porch railings of once proud homes. Claire drove her government-issued sedan down Main Street, a street that used to be alive with the chatter of neighbors and the laughter of children. Now it was a ghost corridor. The few residents she saw scurried along the sidewalks, their gazes fixed on the ground, their shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. The very air, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, seemed to whisper of secrets and fear, a stark, ugly contrast to the crisp, clean mountain air of her memories. She parked in front of a small, weathered house, the only one on the block that seemed lived in rather than merely occupied. Claire stepped out of the car, her movements precise and economical. Her dark, tailored suit was an alien armor in this place of faded denim and worn-out flannel. Her posture was ramrod straight, a habit drilled into her at Quantico. But it also served to brace her against the wave of grief that threatened to crash over her. This was her hometown, but it was no longer her home. She was an outsider here, an agent from a world of protocols and jurisdictions, a world far removed from the simple unwritten laws of loyalty and fear that now governed Iron Ridge. Her analytical gaze swept the street, cataloguing the closed curtains and empty porches, but beneath the professional assessment, her heart ached with the loss of a place she once loved. The front door of Arthur Bishop's house was a barrier of faded blue paint and suspicion. Claire raised a hand and knocked, the sound echoing unnaturally in the quiet street. After a long moment, the door creaked open just a few inches, held fast by a tarnished brass chain. An old man's eye, clouded with cataracts and fear, peered out at her. Arthur Bishop, once the town's most outspoken journalist and her father's closest friend, now looked like a ghost haunting his own home. His face was a roadmap of worry, and his voice, when it came, was a dry, cracking whisper. "We don't want any trouble here," he said, the words a dismissal and a plea. It wasn't just a rejection of a stranger, it was the town's fear personified, pushing away the very idea of help, convinced that any nail that stood up would be hammered down. Claire didn't flinch or show her credentials. She simply met his fearful gaze and held it, letting him see past the federal agent to the girl he used to know. "Arthur," she said, her voice steady and low, "it's Claire, Joseph's daughter." She said nothing more, offering no empty promises of safety, no official reassurances. She just stood there, letting the weight of her father's name hang in the air between them. For a moment, the old man's face remained a mask of terror. Then something shifted in his eyes. He saw it, not just the resemblance in her jawline or the color of her eyes, but the same unwavering fire of integrity that had defined his friend, the stubborn refusal to back down. With a trembling hand, he slid the chain free. The door swung open, and he stepped back, a silent invitation into the archives of a town's forgotten memory. The air inside Arthur Bishop's house was thick with the scent of aging paper, dust, and brewed coffee that had long gone cold. It was a place frozen in time, a library of a town's suppressed history. Every surface was covered in meticulously organized stacks of newspapers, files, and photographs. Arthur moved through the narrow pathways between them with a practiced shuffle, his body a testament to years spent in quiet defiance. He didn't speak much, but his silence was different from the town's. Theirs was born of fear. His was the silence of a watchman, guarding the last embers of truth. Claire stood in the center of the living room, the crisp lines of her suit a stark contrast to the room's organized chaos. She felt the weight of every headline, every faded image pressing down on her, each one a whisper of the injustice that had poisoned her home. With a deep, rattling sigh, Arthur gestured for her to follow. He led her not to a desk or a filing cabinet, but to a heavy wooden door at the back of the kitchen, one she had never noticed as a child. It opened onto a steep, narrow set of stairs, descending into the damp, earthy darkness of a root cellar. The air grew cool and smelled of stone and secrets. He flicked a switch, and a single bare bulb illuminated the small, stone-walled space. Against the far wall was a simple wooden chest. Arthur knelt with a groan, his old joints protesting, and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of old flannel shirts, was a stack of leather-bound journals. "He gave them to me a week before he died," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking. "Said if anything happened, they were for you, and only you." Claire's hands trembled slightly as she reached into the chest and lifted the topmost journal. The worn leather felt familiar, a phantom memory from a life she had long since left behind. It was her father's handwriting on the cover, his name, Joseph Donovan, embossed in faded gold leaf. She sank onto the cold stone steps, the world outside the cellar ceasing to exist. She opened it, her breath catching in her throat. The first several pages were what she expected: case notes, patrol schedules, observations written in his neat, concise script. But as she turned the pages, the entries became more personal, filled with his frustrations, his fears for the town, and his unwavering belief in the law. He wrote about the growing shadow of corruption, the way it was choking the life out of Iron Ridge, and his own increasing isolation. She found the final entry on a page dated the day he died. It wasn't a log of his duties or a list of suspects. It was a letter. It was a message for her. His handwriting was looser, more urgent, as if he knew his time was running out. "They think fear can buy anything," he had written. "They think they can own a man's soul with threats and silence. But courage, my girl, is the one thing that has no price. It's the light you hold inside. Don't let them win." The words blurred as tears she hadn't allowed herself to cry for over a decade finally fell, spotting the old, yellowed page. The professional facade she had so carefully constructed over years of training and discipline shattered, leaving only the heartbroken daughter of a hero who had died alone. In that cold, quiet cellar, holding her father's last words, Claire felt the case shift from a professional duty to a sacred vow. Arthur simply placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of their shared loss and a promise of shared purpose. It's moments of profound, personal truth like this that remind us why some stories are so important to tell. If you believe that too, subscribing to our channel is the most powerful way to help us continue sharing these true accounts of courage against all odds. It was no longer about closing a cold case file for the FBI. It was about finishing her father's fight, not with vengeance, but with the very integrity he had died to protect. The town's silence wasn't just an obstacle. It was a symptom of a disease she now had to cure. She looked up at Arthur, her eyes clear and resolute despite the tears. "I'm not working out of the sheriff's office," she stated, her voice regaining its steady, determined tone. "It's compromised. I'm setting up my base of operations here, with you." It was a declaration that surprised them both, a complete break from protocol. But it was the only move that made sense. To fight the corruption that had taken root in the town's official institutions, she had to align herself with its forgotten memory, its hidden conscience. Arthur simply nodded, his weary face showing a flicker of the old journalistic fire she remembered from her childhood. For the first time in years, the dusty, cluttered house didn't feel like a tomb of the past, but an arsenal for the future. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of tireless work. Claire's government-issued laptop and encrypted satellite phone sat on the old oak dining table next to Arthur's magnifying glass and stacks of yellowed newspaper clippings. They were a strange pair, the cutting-edge federal agent and the analog archivist, bridging a generation of technology and tactics. Together, they began to decipher the coded notes scattered throughout her father's journals. He had used a system of book ciphers and local landmarks, a code only someone who knew Iron Ridge intimately could break. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to unravel the web of extortion, intimidation, and violence that the syndicate had woven around the town, a web her father had been on the verge of exposing. The names that emerged weren't just those of criminals, but of victims. There was Mr. Henderson, the baker, whose shop had mysteriously burned down after he refused to pay protection money. There was the tragic story of the Miller family, whose teenage son had vanished without a trace after witnessing a late-night transaction by the old coal tipple. Each decoded entry was a ghost demanding justice, a story of a life ruined by the pervasive fear her father had fought against. The case file in her briefcase felt cold and impersonal compared to the living, breathing tragedy documented in these pages. She was no longer just the agent investigating a single murder. She was the inheritor of a dozen unsolved sorrows, the last hope for a community of forgotten victims. This was the moment her mission truly crystallized. It was no longer about her pain or her need for closure. It was about the Hendersons, the Millers, and every other family that had been forced into silence. Her father hadn't died just for his own principles. He had died for theirs. This is why we feel compelled to bring these experiences to light, to show that one person's fight can become a beacon for many. Your subscription is what allows these essential stories of quiet heroism to be told and remembered. Claire realized her quest for justice had to be as broad and as selfless as his. She had to liberate the entire town from the grip of fear, to give a voice back to the people who had lost theirs so long ago. The weight of this new responsibility settled heavily on her, resurrecting old ghosts. At night, sleep offered no escape. She was haunted by fragmented memories of the night he died, the flashing blue and red lights painting her bedroom wall, the piercing sound of a siren growing closer, and her own small voice calling for a father who would never answer. The guilt, an old and familiar companion, resurfaced with a vengeance. She had been just a child, helpless and terrified. But the rational mind of the agent could not quiet the irrational heart of the daughter. This internal battle was relentless. She had to constantly fight the rising tide of pure, raw anger, forcing it back down and channeling it into cold, methodical focus. The syndicate, feeling the pressure of her presence, began to push back. The hostility was no longer just in the averted gazes on the street. One evening, a brick crashed through Arthur's front window, a crudely written note tied around it, "Leave the dead buried." The new sheriff, a man whose smile never reached his eyes, paid her a courtesy visit, advising her to let the federal authorities in the city handle the case, warning that her digging was stirring up old trouble. The town, which she had hoped to save, now seemed to view her as the source of its new anxieties. They weren't ready for a savior. They had grown accustomed to their cage and were terrified of the one person trying to pick the lock. Despite the threats, Claire and Arthur's resolve only hardened. She installed a discreet, high-tech security system around the small house, turning their humble base of operations into a fortress. Arthur, for his part, seemed to grow taller, the stoop in his shoulders lessening with each new piece of the puzzle they uncovered. He refused to be intimidated, his quiet courage a mirror of the man they both missed so dearly. Late one night, while cross-referencing one of her father's coded entries with an old property tax map, they found it a name, a date, and a location, an abandoned coal warehouse on the edge of town. It was a tangible lead, the first solid thread she could pull to unravel the entire criminal enterprise. The hunt was truly on. The abandoned coal warehouse stood like a skeletal beast against the bruised twilight sky, its broken windows like hollow eyes watching over the edge of town. Inside, The air was thick with the metallic tang of rust and the ghostly scent of long-dead industry. Claire moved through the cavernous space with a predatory grace, her small, hand-picked federal team melting into the shadows around her. This wasn't a raid, it was an excision. She felt the cool, smooth weight of her father's old badge in her pocket, a talisman not of vengeance, but of resolve. Below, in the main processing area, the low rumble of engines announced the arrival of the syndicate. Headlights cut through the dust-filled darkness, illuminating the figures getting out of the vehicles. The transaction was about to begin, and Claire felt a profound, chilling calm settle over her. The ghosts of this town were watching, and she would not fail them. At her silent signal, the team moved with practiced efficiency, sealing the exits and neutralizing the syndicate's muscle before they even knew what was happening. Claire descended the rusted iron staircase, her footsteps echoing softly in the sudden quiet. She walked directly toward the leader, Silas Thorne, a man whose tailored suit and charismatic smile were a thin veneer over a core of pure rot. He didn't seem surprised to see her, only cynically amused. "Agent Donovan," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "Joseph's girl. He was a fool, you know, an idealist in a world that eats idealists for breakfast. He thought one man with a shiny badge could change the natural order of things. I see you've inherited his sentimentality." He was probing, trying to find the wounded daughter beneath the federal agent's armor, hoping to make her break. Thorne gestured to his associate, who placed a heavy aluminum briefcase on a stack of old pallets between them. With a flick of his wrist, Thorne opened it. The interior was lined with neat stacks of $100 bills, a fortune that seemed to glow in the dim light. $100,000, he offered, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "A finder's fee for a dead end. You file your report, say the trail went cold, and you walk away from this miserable town forever. Go back to your important job in the city. Your father died for nothing, Claire. Don't let his pointless pride be your legacy too. Take the money, buy yourself some peace." It was a venomous temptation, an offer not just of wealth, but of an escape from the pain that had defined her entire life. For a long moment, Claire simply stared at the money, her face an unreadable mask. The air grew thick with unspoken possibilities. Her hand twitched, and for a heartbeat, the raw, primal urge for violence surged within her. She could end him right here, repay the debt of her father's life in blood. But then she saw her father's face in her mind, not broken and defeated, but proud and unwavering. She lifted her gaze to meet Thorne's, and the storm inside her subsided, leaving behind a core of absolute certainty. "My father wrote something down the day he died," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of iron. "He wrote, 'They think fear can buy anything, but courage, my girl, is the one thing that has no price.'" With a swift, deliberate motion, she kicked the briefcase shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the warehouse. The click of the handcuffs as she secured Thorne's wrists was crisp and final. She read him his rights in a steady, professional tone, her voice devoid of the rage and grief that had fueled her for so long. This wasn't revenge. It was justice. It was an act of honor, a tribute to the legacy she had finally come to understand. As her team led the captured men outside, a new sound began to filter in from beyond the warehouse gates. It started as a low murmur and grew into a defiant roar, the sound of car horns, of shouting, of 100 voices rising as one. Arthur had kept his promise. He had broadcast news of the arrest over his pirate radio channel, and the town, so long suffocated by silence, had finally awoken. They were marching on the sheriff's office, their fear finally eclipsed by a flicker of hope she had ignited. The days following the arrests were not quiet, but they were filled with a new and unfamiliar sound. The oppressive silence that had choked the town for a decade was replaced by the noises of life itself, the hammering of saws as storefronts were repaired, the murmur of neighbors chatting over fences, and the bright, clear sound of children's laughter echoing from the town square. Iron Ridge exhaled a collective breath it seemed to have been holding for years. Claire watched from Arthur's porch as the faded "for sale" signs came down, one by one, replaced by hand-painted, now open, banners. The FBI expected her back in Washington, her report filed, and the cold case officially closed. But as she saw the lifeblood returning to the streets, she knew her mission wasn't over. It had only just begun. Her fight was never about closing a file. It was about reopening a future for her father's town. For her town. 6 months later, Claire Donovan wore a different uniform. The sharp, impersonal lines of her federal suit were gone, replaced by the crisp, tan uniform of the Iron Ridge County Sheriff. Her father's old badge was pinned over her heart, but it felt different now. It was no longer a heavy weight of vengeance, but a light, shining symbol of service. The town council had offered her the position unanimously, and her first act was to methodically and completely restructure the department that had failed its people. She brought in new deputies, young men and women from the community who believed in the law because it was right, not because it was profitable. The sheriff's office, once a place of deep-seated fear and corruption, slowly transformed into a genuine beacon of safety. Lights stayed on later in the shops, families took evening strolls, and the pervasive scent of neglect was finally being washed away by the clean mountain air of her memory. The nightmares ceased. The haunting, fragmented images of flashing lights and a father she couldn't save were finally replaced by dreams of a future she was actively building, brick by brick. The relentless internal war between the vengeful daughter and the disciplined agent had at last ended in a truce, leaving behind a woman who was simply, profoundly at peace. She visited her father's grave on the hill overlooking the valley, not to mourn, but to talk, sharing the small victories of her day. Arthur was often with her, his old journalist's spark fully rekindled. He had restarted the Iron Ridge Gazette, and his first front-page story was a tribute to Joseph Donovan, not as a fallen martyr, but as the man who had laid the foundation for the town's remarkable rebirth. Claire had found more than justice in that dark warehouse. She had found her way back home. The Sheriff Joseph Donovan Foundation opened its doors in the newly renovated town hall, its mission to provide scholarships for local youth and offer support to families affected by organized crime. At the inauguration ceremony, Claire stood beside Arthur, looking out at a crowd of hopeful faces that reflected the town's new spirit. She saw the Henderson family, their new bakery thriving, and the Millers, who had found a measure of solace in the justice finally served. A young girl, no older than Claire had been when her own world fell apart, handed her a bouquet of wildflowers. It's stories like this, of how one person's integrity can heal a whole community, that we are committed to telling. By subscribing, you become a part of that mission, helping us share these essential accounts of courage. Claire smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile, knowing her father's true legacy wasn't in how he died, but in the new life that was now blooming all around her.